So welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate it. As you probably saw when you registered for this event, we're hosting this to talk about academic publishing and research. As students ourselves, whether we're in PhD programs or will be in PhD programs, academic publishing is a huge part of what we're going to be expected to do. And it's not always intuitive. There are things that you probably won't know until you get started and you start doing it. So we thought it would be great to have people here, professors who are publishing, have published, and they could maybe answer some of our questions so we have a better grasp on what it's about. So to introduce, my name is Dylan Turner. I'm one of the Graduate Life Fellows in the Center for Graduate Life. I'm in my second year in the Master's in Ethics and Applied Philosophy program here, and will be starting a PhD in geography in the fall.
Thank you, Dylan. I'll take from here. So, hello everybody. I'm Shreya, and I am also a GLF alongside Dylan and Roche, and I am a fifth-year PhD student in the Department of Biological Sciences.
I am also a Graduate Life Fellow. I'm Roche, and I'm in the Department of Engineering. My major is Infrastructures and Environmental Systems. I'm in my fourth year of my PhD program, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Awesome. And then next, our panel of experts. If you all could introduce yourselves, your names, home discipline, area of specialization, and just anything else that you'd like to add. So maybe we'll start with Dr. Truman, then go to Dr. Paquette and Dr. Hammelman, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Andy Truman. I'm an assistant professor in biology. I've been here about five and a bit years. I think that's right. And I study the connection between protein folding and cancer.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Elisabeth Paquette. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be a part of this lovely panel with these wonderful people. So I'm in philosophy and women gender studies. I'm cross-appointed between the two. I'm assistant professor. I'm also affiliated with Africana Studies, Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And I work in continental philosophy and decolonial theory sort of broadly, which also includes critical race theory, critical indigenous theory, queer theory, for instance. So thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Colleen Hamelman, I go by she, her. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences, where I am primarily an urban geographer, focusing on questions of social justice and urban food systems. And I'm also affiliate faculty with Latin American Studies, because I do a lot of this work within the Latin American migrant community here in the US Southeast, as well as in several parts of South America. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all for being here. We're really excited. So just so everyone knows, attendees as well, what we're going to do is start off with Roche, Shreya, and myself. We're going to ask directed questions to the professors. After the person is able to give their response, it'll be opened up to the other two professors on the panel. So we're going to ask 3 questions, one each. And then after that, we're going to open up the floor to a broader Q&A session. So throughout this process, if you want to be thinking about any questions you want to ask, should be able to get an opportunity in the second half of this meeting. So to get us started, I was wanting to ask Dr. Hammelman, if you could, we were wondering, how do you plan out research projects? Do you start one while you're working on another? If so, how do you keep those in track? And yeah, that's our first question.
Great, thanks, Dylan. And thanks for giving me the questions ahead of time. So I've had a minute to think about how I actually put research projects together. And, I tend to think about most of my research projects at any sort of given stage. And so we have sort of the design stage at the beginning. You finally get to the point where you're collecting data, then analyzing data, and then writing it up. And it's not really a linear process in that way. It's something that's much more iterative, going back and forth between them. So if we think about that sort of design at the beginning stage, that is, for me, is really grounded in reading the literature and understanding what other people are saying about the topics that I'm interested in. I'm often responding to requests from community partners because my work is generally community engaged scholarship, or I'm jumping into something that has piqued my interest for one reason or another. And then in all of those instances, I try and bring together both the literature and the work of community partners that I'm engaged with. And then of course that design step also is thinking about grant funding to support the research, how I actually design it. And always I would say a little bit in the back of my mind of what the publications are that are going to be coming out of that, right? So that the design along the way has all of those pieces in mind. Yes, I work on multiple projects at one time. I try and have a project that is in one of those stages at any given time. And so, you know, I was, right before this, I was a couple minutes late because I was submitting a revision on a paper. So I'm writing on some of that work. But as you know, we're working on a project right now where we're collecting data on another project. And then always trying to think about what that next project might be. And so when I am on campus, and my building's currently under renovation, so I'm really not on campus right now, I actually keep a whiteboard in my office that sort of shows the pipeline of each of these projects and things I can move along it, so that I always sort of am keeping myself a bit organized and an eye out for when a bunch of things might converge on me at one time and be too much. But also to see when one project's maybe gotten stuck in one of those phases and hasn't moved in a long time. And so for me, having that visual where I can see the movement of all of my projects along the way is been really cool. And so I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for that. And as we said, you know, Dr. Truman, Dr. Paquette, if you wanted to add your own perspectives on that question, feel free.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you. And I love hearing how other people sort of take up research, because it's always really interesting. Sometimes they're disciplinary differences and sometimes they're just personal differences. And so I know for philosophy, I don't do grant writing. I mean, I do smaller grant writing, and it's often not based in community partnerships. And so there's a very kind of, in a certain sense, it feels as though it's very isolated. And so I get certain ability to choose when I'm going to work on one thing over another. And so with that, I do try to work on only one project at a time. If you think about articles and those kinds of smaller projects. Although I will say, so if I'm working on sometimes I have larger projects, so I'll work on a book project while doing publishing of articles at the same time, which is like at a certain stage is very important to sort of keep both if you're going to work on a book project. And so the book project, I'll sort of, you know, I figure out like how much time can I set aside? When do I have time between other smaller projects? And what is that going to look like? And so I'll go in and out of the book project, and then I'll come back and do sustained research on the articles. And so part of how I can do that is like, I have like a stack of like folders where I put Post-its in, right? So if I'm thinking something about my other project, my book project, I'll write it on Post-it and I'll stick it in this folder, and I can return to it. Because in some ways I feel like I'm always sort of working on all of them, but I really need to like not pull my attention from one to the other at the same time. Or like if I have new paper ideas, I'll put it in a Post-it and put it on my wall, and it'll be like, you know, here's something that I can return to when I have more time to do it. But with philosophy too, something that I want to stress that, you know, I wasn't told when I was a graduate student, is sometimes you also need fallow time. Like you need time to let the fields lay fallow so that you can develop time and you can sort of think through it. And so like there's a certain stress that, you know, I was brought through philosophy with. You always need to be publishing and you always need to be working and producing, but sometimes also having that time to sort of sit with things is really important to incorporate into as well.
Wow, those are some really great points. I think that sort of the way I think about it is sort of a combination of what we've just heard there. I absolutely have multiple projects sort of running simultaneously. Each of my students in my lab are doing a couple of projects each. And I do a very similar thing about planning out. I need a sort of visual representation of that. So actually, I was just looking at I have a whiteboard next to me, and I have Post-it notes with each project, and I sort of move them along each position as I'm gradually going. And that sort of helps me sort of keep track of what's going on. I think my memory is fading as I get older, so that kind of stuff really helps. I really echo that thought about thinking and stuff. And so, you know, a lot of the time in our labs, we're doing experiments and sort of getting results and sort of building up this data. And, you know, there is that trouble of, especially with sort of compressed for time often, we're sort of, and for our students in the lab, there's little chance to actually really think about what those results mean and sort of sit back. And that is incredibly important. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Shreya, I'm not sure if you're coming through.
Sorry, my window just froze. I'm so sorry about that. Well, thank you, Dr. Truman, Dr. Paquette, and Dr. Hammelman. Well, my question, the second question, would be directed to Dr. Truman, and I would like to ask him, could you talk a little bit about the reviewing process after you submit your manuscript? And like a follow-up question would be like, if you are a reviewer for a journal, what kind of things do you look for while reviewing the submission? So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What a great question. Yeah, I review for about 30 different journals, and I'm a senior editor for 2 of them. And so I can sort of see it both from my lab submitting things for publication and also reviewing stuff as well. Typically in our field, in sort of biological sciences, when we submit a paper to a journal, what happens is it goes, there's some initial checking, right? So checking for plagiarism, checking for formatting and things like that. And then the senior editors typically take that, see if it's the right sort of fit for that journal. Like, is the scope correct for that, what that journal publishes? And then reviewers are selected, typically 3 in our field. And then we send the manuscripts to those 3 reviewers, and they have about 2 to 3 weeks typically to review a paper. At that point, those comments come back, the editor collates them and then sends them back to the authors. And they have the chance to address any kind of concerns that people have. They're given a couple of months to do that, and then they can submit that back in a corrected form, explaining what they've corrected or any justifications for things they haven't corrected. And then the reviewers typically review it for a second time, check everything's good. And if it's all good, then the editor can say, we're good to go. And of course, that's an ideal scenario. I mean, there's sort of some caveats to that. Absolutely. So that's the sort of general process that we experience in our field for, you know, how papers are reviewed. What else did it say? And in terms of reviewers, well, then on the other side of that equation, if I'm reviewing a paper, then there's a whole bunch of things that we're sort of interested in. Typically in our field, some journals ask us to comment on the novelty of the findings. But in many journals, they say that's the editor's job. So really the reviewers are checking the author's claims. Like if they say, this does this in a cancer cell, then we have to look at their data and say, does their data show that? So we're just sort of backing that up. Things like formatting of figures, are graphs formatted correctly? Are labels correct? Are the statistics correct behind that? So just checking the sort of accuracy there. And that's really it. It's a little bit variable on the level of the journal, that how strict people are, but that's the general process, I would say.
Thank you very much. I would be interested to know if the process is same across different fields. Would you like to add something, Dr. Paquette or Dr. Hammelman?
Sure, I can jump in. I would say the overall process is pretty similar in geography in terms of submitting to the editor. They take a look at it. They also think, and I hear often whether or not it's a fit for that journal, right? Whether the editor thinks that their journal is the right place for that paper to be, or if it should go somewhere else. And then reviewers and that round of revision. I would say in geography, a lot of the reviews that we get or that I give as a reviewer, because I haven't been a journal editor, are focused on those questions around innovation. Is the paper saying anything that's new? Is there anything that's missing in the argument? So, because we deal a little bit less with, at least on the geography work I do, deals a little bit less in modeling and figures and and properties of cells. And so, you know, we're being reviewed much more of, does your argument make sense? Can we follow the logic? Are the empirics you're providing for your argument, do they actually prove the argument that you're making? And are there any big picture things or pieces of literature that you have missed in making the argument that you are? And so those are all things that you will get, that reviewers will make comments on as well as they look through those papers.
So I can jump into philosophy, and in a certain sense, like I want to echo, like it's a very similar process. And so with that, like echoing what you all said, and I want to sort of just add a couple maybe variations. One, like publishing is full of rejection. And I think that like it's really important to know that. And because often we think that like people just publish it and then it automatically gets accepted wherever they put it. And, you know, you just know this things right away. It doesn't work that way, especially when you are a graduate student. It's really, really difficult to get published. And so even as like, you know, people move through the profession, you know, rejection is still part of academia writ large, right? And so hold on to that, because it's not about us as individuals. Sometimes it's about like the venues we're choosing, the place, you know, whether or not papers can be developed fully. And so that's important to remember. Sometimes reviewers aren't as careful as they could be and have it be like a collaborative process, which is unfortunate. Some journals are better at that than others. And so, you know, these are just things to keep in mind. It's not like a moral or personal failing. It's just part of academia. And so with that too, like sometimes you can find out how long journals will take. And sometimes they'll say that right on the website. I submitted an essay to a journal once and they said, well, we're going to take 2 years to review it. And so I was like, nope, thank you. I'm junior faculty. I have to get something published. And so, but that's not it was a phenomenal journal, but not the right place for me at that time, basically. A way to sort of like to figure out whether you've chosen the right journal, in addition to like the amount of time. If you're citing things that were published in that journal, that's a really good sign that what you're doing is consistent with that journal. And if you're doing interdisciplinary work that I do, whereas I'm like, I do sort of Western philosophy and I do non-Western philosophy, you know, if I submit non-Western philosophy to a Western philosophy journal, for instance, chances are they won't have the right reviewers. They're not going to understand the kind of work that I'm doing. And so like even just ideas of like, oh, this is philosophy, there's the micro distinctions or the disciplinary distinctions to sort of catch there too. Yes, and also rarely do people get accepted as is. Like, so there's different caveats. Rarely will things just be accepted as is. There's always going to be comments, especially reviewers love to give comments and their feedback and that kind of stuff. So, you know, temper it with like, it's part of the process.
I just wanted to echo that and just say, yeah, I 100% agree with everything there. That's absolutely true in our field as well. Rejection is absolutely incredibly common, and it's really hard sometimes, I think, for students as well. You know, if you're dedicating your time, putting hours in, it could be your weekends, you're doing work, and then suddenly, you know, get this paperback saying this work is sort of awful, then that's sort of heartbreaking. And so our recommendation always to reviewers is, and I think about this myself, is, you know, provide the kind of review that I would like to receive myself, right? So have some compassion there, absolutely. It is very challenging. Yeah, and the fit is absolutely key as well. It is very tough. And I would say about choosing the journal as well. You know, there's sort of in every field, I guess, there's a sort of ranking of journals from sort of like the top cited journals right the way down, and there's always the sort of decision on where to send a paper. For us, we can sort of judge that based on the amount of data that we have and our perceived, at least, novelty of the data. It's hard sometimes convincing maybe the editors and reviewers that is also the same level, but yeah, that comes into play. And then again, you can sort of see that is if you look at other papers in your field, are you really matching that kind of level?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I also second, you know, the experience of rejection, and that also, you know, you may get a revise and resubmit designation and find that the reviewers are not so kind, or sometimes they are, or sometimes they contradict each other. And you know, when they go out to 2 or 3 people, you may find one that comes back and says, this argument you made was really great. And another one will argue the exact opposite. And so there's work to be done to navigating through those reviews in a way that you are revising and you're addressing issues that they raise that are hopefully constructive, but you're also not turning your paper into something completely different that you don't agree with just because you're trying to meet what the reviewers have had to say.
I think reviewers often have a challenge where even if they read something they think is fantastic and that there isn't really much to be changed, they feel they're not doing their job unless they actually say, like, do this experiment, add this thing to the paper when it's not really needed. And so I think that as a reviewer, I try not to do that. If there's something genuinely that needs changing, for me, I try to be mindful that this is time and money, you know, for labs that can't really necessarily afford that. I try and ask them to sort of revise their claims a little bit rather than do experiments. As an editor, I think it's important to, you know, to have good editors, right? So if you get reviewers who are very sort of over enthusiastic and say, right, you've got to do, you know, 5 years worth of extra experiments, then it's up to editors to sort of step in and say, I think they're good. I think they addressed everything.
And I'm just to jump on board for one more thing too. Thinking about the review process and like when you submit, or at least in philosophy, when you do a revise and resubmit, you'll often include a cover letter that says, here are the changes that I made and these are the reasons why I changed it. Within those documents too, you can sometimes say, I have chosen not to address this concern that was on the review, and these are the reasons why I didn't do it. And then that's a way to address the contradictions and to be really upfront about it, right? And so it could be that sometimes the reviewers are the same reviewers who read it the first time. They could read your cover letter and say, okay, well, now I understand why this was the case, rather than sort of just trying to fit other people's will. So.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really interesting to see how things are similar in different disciplines, although we are talking from different disciplines, really different disciplines, but how things are similar in journals. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. I have another question for Dr. Paquette. Dr. Paquette, I want to ask you, how do you organize your time that you are able to conduct research, do the writing, also fulfilling other responsibilities such as teaching? I think that you also mentioned about a sentence about timing in the previous questions. So if you want to talk about the timing balance a little more, we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. And so thank you for the question. And I think this question is, it's something that like takes a long time to figure out. And so like for me, it was working through grad school. Even now I'm sort of figuring it out. Sometimes it changes depending on where I am and what's going on. And so, you know, I think be gracious with yourself, and also like be sure to figure out what works for you, because what works for one person isn't going to work for everyone. I find that for me, that I write best in the morning. And so what that means is that, you know, I set aside at least 1 or 2 hours every day that I can, right? It's not going to work every day. And I try and work on the thing that I have tasked myself to do that week or that month, for instance. And so, you know, I was told this early on and I didn't actually realize how significant it was, but like keeping your toe in the water, so to say, makes it so much easier to move a project forward, for me at least, rather than sort of coming back to it, you know, after a couple of days or in a week, especially, because then you have to refamiliarize yourself with all the moves, with all the sort of, the intentions that you had. Whereas if you just do a little bit every day and you set aside that 1 to 2 hours at the minimum, you can really move a project forward much more quickly. And so in a lot of ways, that means that you have to give yourself lots of time, right? So I have, like, for me, I set up a plan every semester of like what I need to get, what kind of work I have to get done. I put my teaching, I put my service in there, and then I put my publications in there too. And so instead of thinking that, like, you know, I can get a paper out in a week like I could in grad school, because that was my primary function, you know, now, you know, I have to give myself a month, and then I work on it for an hour or two sort of every month, every day of the month, to move it forward. And it means also, scheduling in that fallow time or scheduling in, the time when I'm going to turn my attention to teaching or service, in a particular week. And so how I can sort of shift my time, but sticking with it, on the everyday was really, really important. And then I want one more thing that I would add to that is it's really important to have conversations with people about it. And so like this, I think this is really good. Have conversation with faculty, have conversation with faculty in the moment too, and talk to colleagues and fellow students. Like, what are people doing? What's working for them? How do they arrange their time? And then often, for me, as within philosophy, deadlines and accountability has been really, really helpful for me to get work done. So I have writing groups with people. So Friday mornings, I spend 2 hours with a friend of mine on Zoom, and we just sit there and we write. And then we talk about how our projects are moving, and it's set that time that we can set aside where we can't do anything else and we just have to work and we have to write. Same thing, I have this task list where every week I check in with friends of here's the task that I set myself this week, and here's how I was able to achieve them. And sometimes it's I wrote 200 words on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, I did research or something like that. And so one, making sure that they're achievable goals, and keeping accountability as part of it, and having it be an ongoing conversation, because it is not an easy thing to figure out how to manage the research time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paquette. It was great. The point that you mentioned about the deadlines, that's what resonates with me. So we would also love to hear about other panelists if you want to add any points to that.
So yeah, I would echo a lot of what Dr. Paquette said, and really figuring out what works for you. And so trying different things, and and there may be things that work at one point in your life and then don't work in others. And being ready to shift when that happens is really important. I also break my work into small pieces and try and do a little bit every day. And I will start at the beginning of a project and say, okay, if it has to be done by this time, right, these are the pieces that have to happen. And I plan out each step of it down into manageable chunks, right? I'm going to write just on this section this day and just on this section this day, so that I know I can pull an hour out of my day and do that, as opposed to having to sit down and try and find a big chunk of time. I have 2 small kids, one of which I had while writing my dissertation. And so I'm very used to those interruptions that just happen constantly. And so for me, those small chunks worked really well, because my chance of ever getting a big chunk of time to sit and write just wasn't going to happen. And so I was going to say something else, but I don't remember it anymore. So I'll stop.
These ideas are fantastic. I've got to say, I'm writing these down. I'm going to use these. These are great. I'm quite fortunate because I have sort of close to sort of almost 10 people in my lab. Then typically, what students, they're sort of undergraduate students, master's student, PhD students. What we typically do is when people are writing a paper, the student themselves writes the first draft. It's almost like a practice for them. And then they get to sort of share that with the rest of the lab almost sequentially. So the lab also gets practice in sort of looking at data manuscripts and sort of looking at that. And of course, it sort of goes around in a circle. And then eventually I get to see it. And it's sort of been sort of quasi-checked as we've gone along. And then I get to look at that. And then I'll sort of try and sort of make any improvements and sort of discuss that with the student to sort of show them what I'm doing and any kind of, it's a sort of discussion about that. And then we sort of think we're sort of close, then I'll send that to other faculty members just to sort of see if we've, I always think we get snow blindness almost. That's the way I think of it. Like we see the manuscript or whatever so many times, we can't see any mistakes anymore. And so to have this fresh pair of eyes look at it, I think is really useful. And then when that's done, off it goes, and we keep our fingers crossed for a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to return to the question again. I think sharing the materials is really helpful. And so you can do that with, I know people who, we form a little group, but then between us, like we'll share a paper, then everyone will give feedback. You learn a lot by reviewing other people's work. And then you also learn a lot by having different sets of eyes on it, and different questions being raised. And so, I mean, you're fortunate, like when you're taking classes, because you're getting that comment back from professors all the time. And so, when you transition out of classes, sometimes it's harder to get that feedback. And when you're in the dissertation process in particular, the dissertation process is a difficult process in a lot of ways, because in some, like you're standing alone in certain ways with your advisor. And so it's good to form these collectives with other people to share work. Also, conferences are, for me, a pipeline to publications. And so conferences give me a deadline. It's a shorter version of the paper that I'm working on. It gives me feedback, hopefully collaborative feedback from people that are attending the conference. And sometimes it helps me rearrange the paper in my mind, because I know that I have to present to someone in 10 minutes. And so how can I think about a whole chapter in 10 minutes, and what does that look like? And so it can be really constructive in moving those publications along in significant ways.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for these answers to all these questions. I mean, it has been a ton of information to really absorb. I've put in the chat for everyone attending that we are now entering into the Q&A process, and we've gotten a few questions in the chat. So I'll read the first one, and if someone thinks of one later that they want to ask out loud, or if they want to put in the chat, feel free to do so. So Amy wants to know, how do you decide what is valuable for research versus what is interesting when looking for topics? Do journals prefer new, exciting topics or information that is useful?
Wow, that is a great question. I guess for us, this for our field, they're sort of tied in together. I guess there's a question of research that I'm personally interested in versus sort of what's fundable as well. And so I try and balance that. It's often hard. The funding that we get in biological sciences is for specific projects, right? And so we have to on a yearly basis. So if we get money from NIH, we have to sort of say to the National Institute of Health, we completed these tasks this year. So they're seeing what we're doing. It is challenging because, yeah, absolutely. We will have things that we find super interesting to work on, but it's a question of whether other people find it interesting as well and to fund it. I think there's a sort of balance there, right? There's sort of extremes, and I'm lucky that we have this sort of spectrum of work in the project. Stuff that I know is sort of fundable and we can get papers, and stuff that I also find quite interesting, and hopefully I can persuade other people that it's interesting too. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that, right? So and to me, one of the ways that you determine if it's just interesting to you or if there's research interest and value beyond that is by grounding yourself in the reading and in the literature, right? So as you come across something and say, oh wow, that's really interesting, then you go to the literature and you say, has anybody written about this before? And if so, then what does your take on it provide that's new or interesting? If not, is there a reason why it hasn't been written on? Is it something novel that people haven't thought about, or is there something else going on there? And so really taking that step of reading and understanding the literature around what you're interested in can be a really good first step, and perhaps the second and the third step too. It's a pretty iterative process of making that decision.
Yeah, I would echo these points. And I think that, in philosophy, folks are often sort of pulled down by thinking that that there are things that they ought to write about, that they ought to be engaging with. And that is a really quick way to burn out in doing research. And so, find things that you're passionate about, keep questions alive that you're interested in. This is why, like the notes, if I come across something in text, I'm like, well, why is that the case? I read it in a note. And then, like Dr. Hammelman said, then I go to the literature and find out what's the literature saying on it. And that's a way to, as researchers, You know, we're not just producing, we're like engaging in conversations with other folks, you know, in various ways. And so that's a generative process, or ought to be a generative process. And so we're also constantly learning, and that's a way to constantly learn too, is to sort of go wherever the research takes you.
Really awesome points. Well, the next question is, I think, directed more towards Dr. Truman, because it talks about being a reviewer for a journal. Anna asks, as reviewer or editor of a journal, have your work process changed during the last year due to COVID? Journals have guidelines for this type of situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's been very challenging. I mean, as a reviewer, the amount of papers that I've been asked to review has sort of gone up sort of exponentially. I think I did 25 or something like that last year. It might have been more. But what I've tried to do is really, because I knew that labs were sort of closed down, people were really struggling, I really kept my reviewers' comments to a minimum. You know, I tried not to ask for any experiments. I tried to be very positive about the work as much as I could. And if there was anything that really needed clarifying or changing, it was sort of text-based stuff. I also tried to put words of encouragement in the review, you know, because these are people on the other end as well. So I would say things like, we congratulate the authors on these, you know, these very interesting results or whatever during the time of COVID, just to try and give some positivity there. I think it's really important to try and spread that out. As an editor, again, I've tried to really scrutinize reviewers that are asking for a lot of stuff. If they're asking for 6 months of work in a pre-pandemic time, then the researchers can't do that. You know, they just can't. If their labs are closed, if people are ill and they're stressed, they can't do these kind of corrections. And so I really sort of cracked down on that as much as I could. And to keep it, we still obviously want the data to you know, everything to be done properly, obviously, and checked. But at the same time, you know, to really be sort of compassionate in going forward.
Right, thank you. It's been hard for everybody, but hopefully we're all navigating that. I'm doing a good job at it.
So here we have another question from Zara. She wants to know if you have any advice about transitioning from doing guided research in a lab to becoming a more independent researcher.
I think that maybe could apply to all disciplines, not just like lab work, but just from being underneath someone's wing to then kind of being out on your own.
I can go, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I always, as a researcher, even from, you know, undergraduate to graduate student and then postdoctoral researcher, that was my favorite thing. Like, I really liked coming up with experiments. And that's one thing I would say that's sort of particularly challenging. You know, as a you know, running a lab now, I actually still get to do that, but I don't get to do the actual experiments anymore. And this is really sad to me. You know, it depends on the field, obviously, but for us, you know, we get to the stage where we talk, and this previous question, we talked about time management. My time is so limited. I'm doing teaching or writing grants or things like that, or even manuscripts. I don't have time to do the experiments anymore. And this is so sad. I always think of it like being a chef, like, you know, learning to chop food and cook meals and you know, doing that. And then you become some kind of head chef where you never get to cook anymore. You just get to advise other people and maybe write cookbooks. I don't know. It's sort of sad. But maybe one day, if I can persuade my lab to give me a little bit of space, I'll get back in there and we'll do some stuff. That is one of the most challenging things, I think, for students going forward is, you know, often for our field, the students are trying to work out where things are, where equipment is, how to do those sort of experiments. And if experiments don't work, to troubleshoot that. That takes often quite a few years. And as Shreya will attest, she sort of experienced that. Then past that point, it's the idea of maybe I might go to a student and say, can you investigate how this particular thing works in a cell? And they will design their experiment based on that. And I think the final stage of that is the students can come up with everything like that by themselves. They can drive those projects completely forward. And that's really exciting for me. Because I think about the stuff that we do, you know, as researchers, the things that we're thinking about and the things that we're finding out about are, we could be the first people in the world ever to have done that. And there's not many jobs that you can really sort of do that for. So I think that's pretty exciting. So I try and encourage that as much as possible. I do that by gradually sort of building it up in steps. So when students first start, yes, they're sort of quite heavily mentored, and then gradually as they proceed, hopefully they become independent researchers like Shreya now. I mean, you're at that stage, I would say, right?
Yes, I think so, and it's very interesting to also for a student to pass through that transition to be very dependent on your PI, and then because of course you have so many things to do as a PI, you also have your teaching and everything. So it is kind of up to the student to drive their own project and dive really deep into the literature and do the homework and come up with what should be the next obvious step to the project.
So I can jump in, and I obviously can't talk about labs because I haven't been in a lab since 2001, something like that. But for philosophy, I would say, find your spaces and find your people. And so I don't think that philosophy should be done in isolation. I think that we all need networks and we all need mentorship. And so what happens is when you're out of the classroom and you become more independent, you develop networks of relations, or even before, you develop networks of relations outside of that specific institution, which is great because then you can find people who are working on similar things that you're working on, which you maybe wouldn't find in your department. Find people that you trust, find conferences where people are doing similar kind of work. If we think about like the publication system, getting a job, all these things in academia often rely on having extended networks. And so they're really, really important to start establishing as a graduate student, but also make sure that they're productive spaces for you rather than super critical spaces. And then talk to people like, where are your mentors, where are their networks, and how can you get in those spaces too? Because it's not always obvious either.
Yeah, I would say I also haven't worked in a lab, so I can't speak as much from that perspective. But I would echo the importance of collaboration and just all of the different points at which you can find learning opportunities. And then from there, how you can take the mantle, right? To think about how you're not just learning from somebody, but where are there opportunities that you can start to do those steps on your own all along the way. And sort of you slowly build your independence and collaborations outside of just your immediate advisor. All of that provides you some of the building blocks that you need to become successful as a faculty member or in other sorts of research positions.
Great, thank you all. Another question in the chat from Rhonda, who asks, have any of you published books, textbooks, or manuals? And if so, how is that process different than publishing in a journal?
I published a book. I wrote my book right here. If anyone wants to see. Thank you. So I will say publishing a book and working on a book compared to journal articles, it takes a lot longer. It's the first thing to know. Some people think, you have 5 chapters, it's like 5 journal articles, it just takes the same amount of time. And it's not the same kind of process at all because you have to sustain a certain narrative through the entire book. And so that can be quite difficult rather than just sort of these separate points. In terms of the review process, it works in similar kinds of ways, at least where I did my review. So you send off a proposal for it, which means that you sort of say, here's the general area of the literature, here's what people are doing, here's what I'm doing is different, here's my timeline, and every publisher will have different set of requirements that you need to account for. You need to develop your proposal for that. And then usually you set in a couple chapters to sort of prove here's the work I'm doing in addition to your CV and that kind of thing. And so what happens is usually that proposal and those chapters will go out for a review, usually 2 reviews, then you get comments back. And then often, I think when you do an edited collection, they'll send out the smaller part, but then the entire thing will be reviewed by folks as well. for me, like it felt a little less critical, but I think it's because I got really lucky, and I found the right press, and then they found the right reviewers. And so fortunately, I also got to make recommendations on, here are people who are the top people in my field who could review the book. And so they actually chose them, which was really fortunate, because they could have chosen any number of people who would have had a very different reading of the thing that I was producing. So I mean, these are some ways that, it's similar. You'll get, you review it again, you'll respond to the comments that people gave you. And then the whole publication process involves like advertising and that kind of stuff, choosing your cover and the blurbs and all those kinds of things. But those are more fun than anything else.
I was just gonna ask. In my field, we don't typically do many books. They're usually publications. I just wanted to ask Dr. Paquette how long it took to actually write the book.
Yeah. So it was from my dissertation. And so my dissertation took many years. And so it's kind of hard to tell, because from that process, I mean, it was a very different process. And so I wrote the dissertation for a certain group of people. And then what I did is I took the dissertation and I read, there's a publication called From Dissertation to Book, which is a really small book where if you want to, think about publishing your dissertation, that's the book that you read. I think there's others, but that's usually the one that presses, in my field at least, recommend. And then to reformat the dissertation so that it's for a different audience. And so in some ways, books are less, they're less specialized, less sort of defending, less defensive than dissertations. In philosophy, dissertations are all about, fighting off people who will disagree with you. And there's another kind of creative capacity that books allow for. And so I would say it was a few years. Definitely, probably 3 years for the whole process, which included, the bulk of when I wrote it for my dissertation, and then revising it for that particular group.
My field also generally publishes articles. I'm in the process of writing my first book at the moment. And so I can't say a whole lot about what happens after you turn in the full manuscript. I'm doing that next week. But it has taken me, it felt like another dissertation. I did, 4 years worth of research and now 1.5 years worth of writing to get me to a spot of having a manuscript I'm turning in. And I am curious how long the rest of the process will take, but it's been a long time getting to here.
Sometimes it can take a really long time. Sometimes it doesn't take long at all. And I also want to caveat, so I did transform my dissertation to a book. Not everyone does that. Not every dissertation is meant to become a book in certain ways. And so, hold that too. That is not always the case, that's the thing that happens. And that's okay too.
And a lot of that depends on your field, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And in geography, we are more likely to publish journals than we are journal articles than we are books. And so it often makes more sense to do your dissertation as a series of articles than to do it as a full-on manuscript.
Yeah. And also, so I was told where I am here, that you shouldn't try to publish a book right out from your PhD, and that you should instead do the articles because they'll come out faster, it's more guaranteed, rather than sort of holding everything there and waiting for the process, which takes several years. So I think in a lot of ways it's a really good idea to publish it as articles.
Thank you all. Those were very interesting perspectives and points. I actually wanted to ask something a little bit controversial, so to speak. Could anybody talk about the impact factors of various journals and how they are calculated? I know biology, it's all about impact factors, but I wanted to get more perspectives from different disciplines as well. So yes.
I mean, sure. So impact factors are, I mean, for our field it's literally the sort of the average number of times it's cited. That's effectively what it is. And there's a sort of statistic around that. There's a lot of controversy around that, right? The impact factors, because often they're used as a measure of how good a journal is, sort of from top to bottom. In our field, we have, the top journals will be Cell, Nature, and Science. And there's actually a lot of discussion, actually, I think you may have seen this, Shreya, on Twitter, about what is required to get a faculty job in biological sciences at the moment. And everyone's saying, there's a big disagreement. A lot of people are saying you actually need one of those to even sort of be competitive, because there's a few hundred people per place applying for a job in some cases. That's also, so there's that, but also we know that impact factors are really skewed in a lot of journals, just because some articles in a particular journal may be cited many more times than others. So actually, if they took the median, the numbers would be way different as opposed to what they currently do. Yeah, it's very tricky. I think it's tied in with a lot of sort of problems in academia, that the impact factor, and also, as you know, Shreya, the publication fees, how much it costs to actually publish a journal. To give you an example, in our field, we would pay about $2,000 to publish a paper in a journal. Nature just came out a couple of weeks ago and said for open access they want $10,000. Yeah. So you can imagine that's absolutely insane. And you can think about countries around the world that don't have that. Even my lab, in America, right, we have a lot of research funds. We don't have that ability to be able to do that. So even if we have fantastic data, we can't publish it in those journals. And there's sort of exclusion there, there's a gatekeeping there that's sort of occurring. So there's a huge backlash about that. I mean, in my what we're ending up doing is, you think when we're applying for NIH grants, which is taxpayer funded, we're actually putting in huge amounts of money allocated for publication fees. Very, very troubling. So yeah, that's got to be fixed at some point, I guess.
So this is one of the questions that you all had, like, how much does it cost to publish? And I read the question and was like, who would ever pay for publications? So because in my field, it doesn't happen. You don't pay for publications. You ought not be paying for publications. And so again, this is a very different field because we don't apply for grants. And so it functions very differently in those ways that we're not expected to apply for grants. And we are, our tenure is not determined by a grant. Our salary is determined by grants, all those kinds of things. I know for other folks it is. So if you're ever being asked to pay money for a philosophy journal, you should not be doing it. Sometimes, like I know from my book, I got a couple of chapters open access. If I wanted the whole thing, it was $5,000. The library paid $1,000 and it was a couple chapters. But again, I'm not paying for that kind of thing. The one thing you will pay for is conference fees, but as graduate students, they should be, $25 kind of thing. So I know other fields are also a lot more. So within the same vein, I do not know my H factor, the index factor, whatever it's called. I've never looked at it. And we don't have to be concerned with it in similar ways. Maybe other departments operate in different ways, but it's not something that in this department of philosophy, and I know for many departments, they're not concerned with those numbers in particular. And often it's more of a narration around what are the top journals. And, that list has been constructed somewhere. That list is also problematic in a number of ways. If you do decolonial theory or non-Western philosophy, none of those journals are included in that. And so there's ways in which they're sort of pushing against those institutions. But for us, fortunately, H factor is not that important.
Yeah, so in my field, we don't often pay to publish articles either. Usually that's the sign of a predatory journal. And so it's one of the things that's worth keeping in mind. And not only just like that impact factor, and I would agree in at least in my department, which is geography and earth sciences, right? We are very interdisciplinary within a department. And so we spend a lot of time saying, while I want to say that the meteorologists publish very often in a journal called Weather Monthly or something along those lines, that in a lot of other fields you would look at and be like, what kind of a journal is that? But it's one of their top journals. And so we spend a lot of time in our material saying, this is one of the top journals and we know it for these reasons. as opposed to just looking at that impact factor. But it's also a good idea to watch out for those predatory journals, because there are a lot of journals out there that will ask you for a lot of money, say they can turn it around really fast, and are not very good high quality journals. And so if you are ever uncertain as to whether or not a place that has reached out to you and asked for an article, or if just something you're looking at, if you're unsure about whether or not it's a good place to be publishing, that's definitely a good question to take to your advisor or to collaborators or to other people in your field. And so we do pay to have open access. And so, but in my field, that's usually, $1,000 or something like that to get an open access article. Yeah. I couldn't imagine paying $10,000 to publish a paper.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was great to hear from different disciplines, because about all particularly about the expenses, because I always had this discussion with my friends, like we are a group of interdisciplinary people, and some of them were telling to others that this journal that you are publishing may not be a good journal because they're getting lots of money from you, and the other person were from another discipline, and she was, no, this is one of the top journals in our discipline. And I saw people fighting around about this with each other, because like they are not aware of other disciplines. And now that you are talking about it, now I understand that how it is different in different disciplines about the expenses of publishing. Thank you so much for that. So for with that, if there is no question, it's 2:59. We're right on time, and I don't see any more questions in the chat. We are so thankful, so grateful from our panelists. We're sure that you are pretty busy with balancing your time with publications and services and teaching, and we learned a lot from you. We're so grateful, and so grateful from our audiences also. Thank you so much for joining us. And so if there is no more questions, we can close the session.